Hey everyone, Callum here, event producer at Product Marketing Alliance. Product Marketing Summit is now a 17-city global series, and we've got the biggest one of the bunch coming to New York on March 13th and 14th. We've got an all-star lineup curated just for PMMs, featuring speakers from companies like Microsoft, TikTok, LinkedIn, and more across 3 whole tracks of content. We'd love to see you there, so all you need to do is head over to www.productmarketingalliance.com and find the summit under the events tab. And guess what? We're also giving listeners 20% off their tickets. Simply register now and use the code podcast20 in all capital letters to secure your seats at the summit. See you there.
Amazing. So, Tamara, welcome to Too Long Don't Listen. I'm very happy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
And I'm very excited to have you because, as you know, the whole point is to cover specific product marketing paths and understand how you got into the role and dive into specific challenges as well. So I think the first question that makes the most sense is to ask you if you can tell our listeners, well, what have you been up to so far and what you're doing today, and how did you get into product marketing?
Sure. Yeah. So I always like to say I'm a career product marketer, which basically just means I've been doing it for a really long time. Over the course of my career, like over a decade, just in product marketing, I really specialized in building and scaling teams. So I was the director, then VP, and then chief strategy officer over at Unbounce. Then I moved to Kajabi. I was the VP of product marketing there. And then after kind of growing my career, I ended up breaking off to do my own thing. So now I run a company called PMM Camp, which is really a resource and community for product marketing leaders. But to answer your first question of how I got into all of that, it was kind of accidental, which is what a lot of folks say. I actually thought originally I wanted to be a writer or work in publishing. So I went to school for professional writing. I actually did my master's in publishing. And I started working in magazines, and I found that it was just so slow. The pace of work, the pace of change, the pace of decisions. And just about that time, things in digital were getting really popular. Now, this is probably aging me a bit, but so like social media was just coming about. This concept of like, okay, we have a print magazine, but we also need to put content online. And so I started really specializing in the publishing world around digital content. And then truly one thing just led to the other. And somehow I ended up working in tech. But it was definitely an accidental path to get there.
But I mean, it sounds accidental, but I think you probably were drawn into the digital world because you were already involved in like learning about different products. Is that because now I know your podcast is about that as well? So was there a connection there?
Yeah, I think so. And like, I loved the creativity of kind of the digital space in the sense of you could create a story, put that story online, and then get response immediately, right? Which was kind of what was missing for me from the typical traditional publishing world, where it's like, okay, I'm working on a magazine issue 12 months from now. Then I have to wait for it to get published to even get feedback. And by that point, we're already planning the next year. So I loved that kind of live feedback, and then being able to take that, same as what we do with a product launch today, and then incorporate that into like maybe an adoption campaign or a follow-up. So there was definitely a lot of parallels from that perspective, definitely.
Interesting. So I have a very dry question for you, and this is more around, I want to hear your perspective on what is product marketing. I know there's a lot of different definitions out there, and as you said, like some product marketers fell in the job accidentally because they just started doing it without even knowing it. So what does being a product marketer mean to you?
Yeah. I think being a product marketer at its core is all about storytelling, but it really is a two-way door. So as a product marketer, you're the voice of the market back to the product team or to the company at large, but you're also the voice of the product back to the customer, to the market. And so you're kind of navigating this two-way street, and there's a lot of things that go into that. But I think oftentimes we kind of forget that it is a two-way street, and we just think, oh, product marketing creates marketing that goes out to the customer. And it really is more of like an actual loop. So it's like, how do we tell stories internally that get people bought in, that get people to really deeply understand who the customer is, that get people to understand the market opportunity? Then how do we work with product to build the right products that we can then build stories around to bring it back out to the market, to get customers to care, to get customers to adopt? So storytelling is really that common thread throughout both, but it's about kind of facilitating that two-way door activity.
I'm very happy you mentioned the buzzword storytelling, because that's a big part of being a product marketer. And I'd love to dive into it with you. And you have a background in publishing and telling stories. So I'm sure that really helped you shape your product marketer soul in a way. Can you tell me a bit more on how that kind of shaped your career? You mentioned a couple of companies like Unbounce and other B2B SaaS companies. How was it doing storytelling with B2B SaaS in general?
Yeah, I think the concepts apply whether you're trying to market a book or market a digital product or market like the most boring software on earth. The core concepts apply, which is in order to tell a story, you need to know who you're telling that story to. And so the first step I always say is just understand and actually make a decision about who is our audience. And I think this is honestly where most people go wrong. They don't spend enough time on this step, or especially if you're a product marketer, maybe you don't have like a lot of decision-making ability. Your founder or whoever is in charge is pressuring you. Well, the story needs to be broad enough that it appeals to everyone, or we need to leave some doors open. But the more refined and the more specific you can get on this step, the more powerful your story is going to be. I believe that to be true. So I always say, really focus on that first step of understanding who that customer is. What do they care about? What are the problems they're experiencing? You know, all of that good stuff. Then from there, it's just about connecting that customer and what their pain points are to the value that your product can bring to solve those problems. And so again, that's the same whether it's a book or it's a B2B SaaS product. I think oftentimes we'll say, well, we shouldn't get inspired by B2C. That's a distraction. They can play with things that we can't play with. But I disagree with that. I think good storytelling is good storytelling, regardless of who the end audience is or what the product is. And so personally for me, whenever I'm out and about in the world, whether I'm buying something or watching an ad or anything, I'm always trying to learn about how do other people tell stories, what made me connect with that story, and how can I like kind of incorporate that into my work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm very happy you mentioned B2C versus B2B, because there's this misconception that when you're doing B2B marketing, it's different from B2C. But at the end of the day, it's humans who are receptive of your message. So the persona profiling is really important. And I'd also love to learn more about your processes around that, because I know, for example, in my experience, it's always about bringing together internal stakeholders, understanding what their understanding is of user personas, and then mapping that out with your own research as a PMM to show the gaps in the company, because usually there's some misconceptions or lots of biases. Do you have your own kind of process to navigate personas and user profiling?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, especially if it's within the context of how we're going to build messaging positioning. So
Yeah.
I actually like to start by aligning on some like key definitions, because I think we use the words messaging, positioning, website copy interchangeably and synonymously sometimes. And so I like to align on a shared definition. And the best definition I ever heard was from my friend Zach Messler. So I always repeat his definition, which is positioning is how you want to be seen. Messaging is what you say, and then copy is how you say it. So I'll kind of start that internal stakeholder group around aligning on that, just so we know when we're splitting hairs or we're trying to understand how an audience persona fits into that process. We understand each of those stages. Then for my process for actually doing personas or segmentation is I like to start with data. And so I've been really fortunate that the companies that I work at have dozens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of customers. Typically, I work in more product-led PLG style companies. So we do have massive data sets. And so I let the kind of the data guide me yes, sometimes I'll have a hypothesis, or sometimes, maybe one of my other stakeholders will have a hypothesis, but I try to be as unbiased as possible in that first discovery stage. And what I'm really looking for is, who do we have a lot of? Like, which types of customers or which type of criteria can we start to cluster customers around? It could be, a particular job title. It could be really a certain industry they work in. It could be a variety of things. Then I want to know, okay, great. It's not enough that we just have a lot of them. We want to make sure that that customer is valuable to us. So then I'm starting to look at, well, does this type of customer spend more money on average with us than someone else? Do they convert better than a different type of customer? What is the product behavior? Are they actually more likely to adopt the product or adopt it in the way that we want them to adopt it? And then I kind of merge those two things together to make an assessment about which persona we should be prioritizing for this. And I find that when we do that step up front, which requires a little bit more work, and we bring that as almost like a proposal to that stakeholder team, you're much more likely to have an actual helpful conversation where it's not just about people's biases, but it's actually about the data I'm presenting them. So, someone can say, well, I actually still think we should talk about that persona instead. And I can say, great, well, show me why they're more valuable for the business. Show me how, we're going to attract more of them to make sure that we can actually have the impact that we want to have.
Yeah.
So I find that that's actually really my starting point, and then we refine from there.
I cannot agree more with data is your biggest weapon against bias, right? To me, that's definitely something, I think that's what drives also PMMs. And it's part of another question I have for you actually around measuring your impact as a product marketer. I know you're very big on, and we'll talk about PMM Camp as well, because I think it's a great resource for any PMM out there. But knowing you're talking a lot about go-to-market strategies and how to measure your impact as you're going through a launch or anything like that. So can you tell us more about, as a PMM, what should I be looking for to know that I'm doing my job right? Because sometimes I find it personally tricky when you're working with so many people on a team or different functions. Your work and your efforts get lost in seeing other functions succeed. It's a bit tricky, but that's how I see it sometimes. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And unfortunately, there's no perfect answer. But I think about it two ways. I think about there being two altitudes of metrics. The first altitude is the highest level one. And again, if you're just a PMM and you're maybe not the leader of the team, you might not be able to influence this. But since I've typically been the leader of the team, what I try to do is I try to assess our overall mandate. What is my product marketing team needing to do at this company? And that's going to be a different answer, right? For some, maybe you're helping drive acquisition. For others, maybe you're focused on retention. It could be a variety of things. And typically this is going to be a mandate that lasts 12 to 24 months or beyond. So I'm constantly reassessing these, but at least on an annual level, I'm choosing a high level metric that my whole team can align around. One that I love is this idea of segmented metrics. So for example, maybe the company as a whole wants to work on achieving a certain conversion rate for trial to paid customers. That's awesome. And to your point, many teams are going to work on that. But what I might do for my team is I might say, you know what, as a product marketing team, we're going to focus on increasing the conversion rate of our segmented customers. So our customers in our priority persona that we just discovered, we aligned everyone on, because this is something we can actually tangibly do. We can improve the messaging and work with teams to roll that out. We can improve the customer lifecycle experience and make sure that that makes sense for the segment. We can optimize potentially even pricing, right? There's a ton of things we can do. And because we're going to have something to contrast it to, like the average customer, the average score, we can actually show the delta in our change. So from a strategic perspective, I love to anchor on a metric like that. In the weeds, and as an individual PMM, this is where I think it's okay that we lean on more project-based KPIs. And I know there's a lot of folks who don't like that, but I think we lead a lot of projects and initiatives. Yeah. Why not measure the success of those? And so what this means to me is, maybe you're leading a launch. actually getting clear on like what the metrics should be for 3 months post-launch. And again, not putting every metric across the board, but being really clear about for every initiative that you're doing, what's the one change we're trying to drive here? Is it net new customers? Is it deepening adoption? Is it maintaining customers and reducing churn? Is it making the sales team more confident in the intel we're giving them? Because it doesn't have to be launch related, but whatever it is, align on that one priority metric and then measure your work based on that. So I think if you implement those two different altitudes, so project-based and then kind of like strategic team mandate, that typically tends to be a good pairing in terms of being able to measure success.
That's a very interesting approach. I know for a fact that some PMMs don't like the idea of it's all project-based, but I think it's about how you frame it, right? So let's say you're clearly driving that change that you said you wanted to drive in the beginning of the launch or anything that you're planning. It's always good to go back to those aspirational metrics and share them with your team and be vocal about it. I feel like that's something I regret not doing enough sometimes, being vocal about the change I drove. So yeah, thanks for sharing that perspective. I'm sure a lot of people will benefit from that framing. I also wanted to talk about, now let's talk about PMM Camp actually, because the transition through PMM Camp is to also discuss how I know you're a big fan of pricing, and that's kind of also during your workshop that I attended at the PMA Summit. We talked about pricing and your views on that, and I'd love to know. First, let me break this down into 2 questions. So if you can tell us more about PMM Camp, and through that, I'm sure you'll mention that you share lessons in your newsletter. And one of those lessons is about pricing. So if you can share with us live something you learned from being super close to pricing teams and work, that, yeah, you can share with us. So 2 questions, I'll let you answer.
Amazing. So really, PMM Camp is a resource for product marketing leaders. And now the first question I often get is, well, what's a product marketing leader? To me, a product marketing leader is not just a people manager, right? It's anyone who manages a function, a portfolio, or a team. And the reason I built PMM Camp for leaders is there's so much resources and information out there for people who are early stage product marketers. And that's amazing. But I found myself, as I was progressing in my career, I was starting to get lonelier and lonelier. And I started to realize there isn't necessarily one person I can learn from or one resource that I can use. I actually really want to learn from my peers. And I want to learn from folks who are in the trenches, who've already mastered the basics and the foundations and are now kind of digging into a bit more trickier, stickier things. And so that's kind of like the spirit of PMM Camp. So my community, it's a private community. That's really the heart of the business. And that's where I'm having like conversations with folks every single day. We have private events and we're really just kind of doing peer-based learning. But then also I have a ton of free resources that I make available to other product marketing leaders outside of the community. And one of those is my newsletter, as you mentioned. It goes out every Sunday. And what I try to do is I try to choose one strategy, one framework, one principle, and break it down. And often these are things that I'm either doing in my day-to-day right now. So I also do consulting. And so maybe as I'm doing my product marketing consulting, I come across a framework I like, or, it makes me think of something. Or it could be something from my past experience, or it could be something that a camper has brought up to me and wants me to cover. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of the business. And you mentioned pricing. Pricing's one of my favorite parts of product marketing.
I know.
And I think I got into it. Yeah, I got into it for a couple of reasons. One, no one ever wanted to work on it. So I always saw it as one of those opportunity parts of the business where I was like, I'll raise my hand, sure. And then 2, it really does lean on qual and quant data, which I love. I love the intersection of those 2 things. A question around pricing learning. I think a couple of things are coming up for me. I think one of them is about the importance of internal buy-in. And so I'll give the example of how most people actually are so scared of pricing. They don't want to lead it. They don't really want to make decisions. But what happens is by the end of the pricing project, they kind of get shown the proposal, and then it turns out they have a lot of reactions. And so I've kind of learned the hard way that even if people are scared of pricing, it's better to bring them into the process from the beginning, because pricing truly is beyond just marketing and revenue, right?
Yeah.
It impacts how we deliver the customer experience. It impacts how sales sells the product, how they renew the product. It impacts our financials. It impacts company projections. And so my biggest tip to anyone working on any meaningful pricing project is to kind of compile a stakeholder team. And not just to say, well, I'm leading it and I'm just bringing you guys together to keep you up to date, but actually assign every person on the team a role. So they are clear about like their responsibility. And it's almost a two-way street as well. It's like they get to come to the meeting and bring the perspective of their teams, but then they also have the responsibility to go back to their teams and share what's happening in those meetings and in the project so that by the end, there's no surprises. I honestly think that's the best advice I can give for anyone working on pricing.
But I think, the role of accountability in especially small teams, when there's not a lot of people, everyone feels like they need to do a lot of things, but then to get something through to the finish line, it's always tricky because you end up doing other things at the same time. And I say this because I've been working with startups mostly, so it's almost like one thing I noticed. And definitely holding each other accountable. So as you said, bringing people together, and you taking that leadership is what's needed sometimes. Like, we need direction. It doesn't mean you're going to make the final decision, but you bring people together. I think is I could see that as a very actionable tip for a PMM. Speaking of another lesson learned, or a thought that you shared in your newsletter, and I think this was last week or the week before, you mentioned that PMMs should start learning to incorporate AI tools in their day-to-day. And I'm very curious to talk about this because there's a lot of opinions out there. I'm a big AI fan, although with limitations, of course. I think AI can help us do our job faster. But for example, I hate writing blogs with AI. They just feel super dry. And, I do have limitations. But I'd love to hear from you why you think PMMs need to technically, keep up with the race in a way. And how do you see AI shaping our role as we move forward?
Yeah. I really view AI as a partner, and I think the more we can get on the same page with it being something that's going to help amplify what we're already great at rather than take something away from us, the faster we're all going to be successful. I mean, the reality is, and we've seen this in the job market the last few years, the reality is teams are getting smaller. Product marketers are having to do more, both having a broader mandate and a larger amount of work. And we're being stretched thin. And so, I'm seeing teams that used to be maybe 5 product marketers now being 2 product marketers. There's so many folks who are maybe a solo or founding product marketer. And truly, it is impossible to do everything. Yeah. And so I view AI 2 ways. There's efficiency gains, and then there's kind of like impact and going like actually amplifying work. So the efficiency gains is a no-brainer place to start. And so for me, I kind of looked at my workflow and I said, what are ways that I can just simplify, or I can get rid of mundane tasks, whatever it might be. And so it's as simple as having a call recorder, join my meetings. And then honestly, I had tried this like a year and a half ago, and the quality was so terrible because personally, I never go back and listen to recordings. But I like the transcript, or I like the ability to have like a summary, and it sucked a year ago. But now it's so much better. And so that's why I kind of encourage folks, if you tried stuff a while ago, try it again because the technology is evolving. And so for all my meetings, whether it's a client meeting or a meeting with a camper, whatever it might be, I record it and then I can look at the summary after. I copy and paste my summary of the call into a Notion document where I track every conversation I have. So now I have a repository of my conversation. So I know the next time I talk to you, hey, this is what we talked about last time, or here's a reminder to follow up on that topic. Mm-hmm. So simple things like that can really go a long way. But then from the amplification side, I think really using AI as like a strategic thought partner. And so oftentimes I'll give it kind of a situation and I'll ask it, what am I not thinking about that you think I should be considering? And honestly, it kind of just works as a colleague. The same way if you're in a meeting with a colleague, you're not always going to take their advice, but it is going to make you think. It's either going to make you refine your argument because you're going to be even more clear and convicted on, what you have decided, or maybe it is going to introduce a new perspective or a new way of framing it. And so to your point, I'm not using AI to create content, at least not yet. I'm using it more in one of those other two ways, or
Okay.
to analyze data. For example, here's a big spreadsheet, help me identify trends, things
Yeah.
like that.
I'm kind of relieved hearing that because I feel like a lot of people kind of get easily influenced by content creation one-on-one with ChatGPT or other tools. I know there's Jasper.ai. I'm not sure if you looked into that, but it's pretty much like for marketers. And I don't know why it just doesn't feel right. Like you're losing your tone of voice. But I like the, efficiency versus amplification. That's an interesting way to look at it. Um, do you have any maybe tools you can share with us in terms of one for efficiency and one for amplifying your day-to-day tasks?
Yeah, definitely. So for my kind of efficiency one, I've tried a bunch of different AI call recording meeting assistants. The one I love the best, it's called Fellow. It's amazing. It works so well, and it before all of my calls, it actually sends me like a bit of a pre-read, and it'll say, and it'll do the research for me. Hey, your meeting with so and so. This is their job title. This is what we know about them. Or if I had a following meeting, like for example, I have a weekly meeting with one of my clients. And right before my next meeting, it'll say, here were the items that you discussed last week, and here are the items you need to follow up on the meeting. So that's amazing. So I love Fellow. If I'm having just a more casual meeting and maybe I don't want my call recording to be there, but I want to take notes, I love a tool called Granola AI. It's really cool. And basically, it almost looks like an Apple Notes application, but it just helps you kind of fill out your notes as you go. So, highly recommend
Nice.
that. Honestly, from the kind of amplification perspective, I have really found the most success with ChatGPT. So I know that's basic, but it has the most up-to-date models. I have a
Yeah.
paid plan, and I really utilize the folder functionality. So if you haven't used it recently, there's folder functionality where you can create kind of focused conversations. You can upload documents and kind of I'll have like a main prompt kind of baked in there. I'll have maybe a messaging framework that they can use, context on whatever I'm working on, so I don't need to constantly give it.
Yeah.
So that's the main tool for that. Honestly, I've gone back and forth trying different tools, but I've found the more that I use one tool, the better it gets to know me. And so there is some sort of like compounding from choosing a tool and sticking with it.
It's almost like you're building attachment and you can't let it go anymore. I feel the same way with same as you. Like for ChatGPT, I always go back to ChatGPT. I think it's all about how you use it, though. I think there's tricks around what you said about what am I missing here, or not
Mhm.
essentially write this blog for me, but you can even ask it to generate ideas or help you evaluate or
Yeah,
reassess ideas. Like I used ChatGPT when I was repositioning my podcast, so it kind of
yeah.
helped, I hope. um
Exactly.
yeah.
I love that. And like, I believe in AI so much. So I actually have hired us in PMM Camp an AI coach. So my
Yeah.
friend Jess Petrella, she's amazing at AI. So she comes to the PMM Camp community once a month and teaches us for an hour AI workflows, AI tools. Like I'm that invested in that this year. And I think everyone needs to be. So if it's not
Yeah.
on your radar, put it on your radar.
Yeah, no, it's, and also if this goes without saying, make sure to subscribe to Tamara's newsletter. I think since I subscribed, I've been reading your post on a Sunday. Like it actually works, and I
Well, thank
think
you.
it's very short, very straight to the point. Like and you always end up learning something. So I definitely advocate for that. And we're reaching the end of the podcast. This is my final question to you, Tamara. I'd love to know if you could pick one tip to
Mhm.
aspiring product marketers, what would it be?
Yeah. I think a lot of product marketers, especially like as they're in the early stages or they're wanting to transition into product marketing, they feel overwhelmed by the diversity of skills that are required or feel like it's required to learn. And my advice is yes, over time, you are going to have to kind of figure out what type of a PMM you are, and you are going to have to learn messaging and positioning and this and that. But honestly, the one skill that I have seen that is important across the board, and I think is going to become even more important as AI comes into our lives, is a deep sense of curiosity and learning to foster that curiosity and then turn that curiosity into high quality questions. Because I have found the product marketers who can ask the best questions produce the best work, right? If you don't have that curiosity, you're actually not going to dig into the right data. You're not going to have the energy to keep going. You're going to take surface level answers and you're going to go with it. And I truly believe moving forward with AI, almost like we've been saying here with the amplification, the ability to work with AI and ask it the right questions is going to be the difference between, incredible work and average work. And so I would say just, it's okay. You're going to figure out all of the actual practical skills, but focus on those skills first, because those are actually what's going to get you further in the game.
Yeah. And I'm actually surprised in a good way that you're mentioning a soft skill rather than, you need to learn all of the frameworks out there, because it's true. I do believe you can definitely learn on the job as long as you're eager to learn. That's the whole point. I need to ask. You're going to be working with so many people. You need to be curious about what their goals are and how you can support each other. So yeah, thank you so much, Tamara. I really enjoyed this conversation with you, and you were the first PMM focused episode recording. So
I love it. Thank you for having me. It's been great chat.